Mortimer, what is that you're holding in your hand?
It's a piece of floor.
Piece of floor? Why are you holding that in your hand?
Charlie said I should hang on to it.
Oh, Mortimer, do you do everything Charlie says?
Yep. No. Yeah, I do.
This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the cyclist was solitary, the bachelor was noble, and the resident was patient, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? On which 3 continents did Watson have experience of women? When did 221B Baker Street first get telephone service? And why does Holmes prefer telegrams over writing?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 387, Linoleum. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you are going to be floored by what we have to talk about today.
I'm already floored and tacked down, so I'm okay.
Perfect. Well, we are going to talk about, as the title suggested, linoleum, a type of flooring. It does appear in the Canon in very sparse places, and we will be discussing where that is and how it came to be. But if you would like to get the show notes for this episode, they're available on whatever app you happen to be listening to us on, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or SoundCloud, YouTube, etc. But they are also available at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. There you can sign up for email updates from us. You can also sign up for email updates from us on Substack. We do have a monthly drawing that we do for all of our paid Substack supporters and our Patreon supporters, people who support us for as little as $1 a month. Everyone is eligible at the end of the month to have their name inserted into a big drawing for, you guessed it, a back issue of the Baker Street Journal, where you can learn all about trifling topics since the origin of the Baker Street Journal in 1946. It is still going today, and you can subscribe to them as well if you would like. So stay tuned for our drawing at the end of the show, and if you aren't yet supporting us, we highly recommend that you do. Okay, Bert, take off your shoes and dig your toes into this comfy, squishy linoleum. Actually, that's not linoleum at all, is it? I would imagine somewhere in your childhood, like in mine, you probably had some linoleum in your house, whether it was in an entryway or a kitchen or some other highly trafficked area that needed to withstand a lot of shoes and feet and spills and all the rest.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, it's any kind of flooring, is a very good bet that in our lives, I mean, unless we've spent our early childhood floating in midair, which as attractive as that sounds, I think is very unlikely. You will have had some experience with linoleum, but your experience will be exactly the same as mine, which is you never paid a moment of attention to it at all. Unlike Sherlock Holmes, who has devoted a moment of attention to everything.
He has. And we have talked about flooring in the past on Trifles because Well, of course we have. I think it was all the way back in season 2 when we were looking inside 221B. We did a monthly series, so we have 12 episodes there in season 2 called Inside 221B. And the final episode, episode 102 in that series, was called On the Floor. In that case, we looked at carpeting and hearth rugs, particularly the bearskin rug in 221B. But we didn't get a chance to talk about linoleum. And I suppose it's okay that we glossed over it at that point, although there are very few mentions of linoleum in the stories. And where might we come across them?
Well, it's interesting that in the first reference, it sort of gives you a great lens into this, and because it's really actually quite interesting. But as an example, in the Adventure of the Naval Treaty. Now, if you remember the Adventure of the Naval Treaty, this important document has gone missing. And there's an investigation that takes place in the government offices from which it has disappeared. And immediately what happens in the case of Sherlock Holmes is all of those events are dug into exactly what happened and where was this one and where was that one and what time was it and who went where and who was seen and who wasn't seen. And in all of that conversation, what you have is a statement that reads, "Then we returned to the office and searched the stairs and the passage without result. The corridor which led to the room was laid down with a kind of creamy linoleum, which shows an impression very easily, and we examined it very carefully, but we found no outline of any footmark." And that is a wonderful departure point for, just talking about linoleum just briefly for a second, because linoleum was a mid-19th century invention by a guy named Frederick Edward Walton. And he was a manufacturer and inventor who invented linoleum in Chiswick and patented it in 1863. And Walton was a guy who happened to notice, he had a can of oil-based paint lying around, and he happened to notice the flexible skin of solidified linseed oil. What happens with oil-based paint, if you're a painter, is that you have this pigment of whatever the color is, but it is made malleable and thinned by adding a solvent like linseed oil. And linseed oil degrades, evaporates relatively slowly. So if you're an oil painter, the lovely thing about painting a canvas with oil paint is you can come back and you can scrape off and start again, as opposed to acrylic paint, which has a very rapid, which cures relatively rapidly compared to oil-based paint. And there you're sort of stuck. You could put something on top of acrylic, but it's not a great thing to be scraping it off a canvas. So linseed oil, is this solvent for paint. Well, anyway, he accelerated this process of getting a skin on top of solidified linseed oil by heating it, and did a variety of things.
The same thing happened to me when I make pudding.
Right.
That skin.
But unlike Walton, you did not try to put it on the floor.
No, I did not. Well, it did end up on the floor, but not by any kind of design.
Yeah. Well, anyway, to cut to the chase, Walton develops a number of methods to accelerate this process. He combines it with other materials, and unfortunately, what happens to him? It becomes very popular in the 1860s, but by the 1870s, he has a lot of competition from people who have different processes, and unfortunately, he never trademarked the name.
Oh, no.
And so, like Xerox and Kleenex, linoleum quickly becomes a common descriptor for the floor. And his his name, the name linoleum, comes from the Latin words linum, or flax, and oleum, oil. And of course, this was the deal where, this solidified linseed oil basically was combined with some sort of, flax or other material, to create these sheets that could be put down on the floor.
Yeah, I think initially he started coating cotton and found that the cotton cloth fell apart. And then he created, and I guess that was called linoxin. Once he heated the oil to form a resinous mass, and then dipped the cotton in it. But it took a long time to do that, so he then started mixing sawdust and cork. And if you've ever been on a certain linoleum, there's a very thin, flat, hard type of linoleum, and then there's more of a almost a cushion-like linoleum, one that would seemingly have something like cork or foam in it, which gets us back to the man with to the naval treaty. They said it would leave footmarks there, and it would be more of that cushioned, the cork or the sawdust internal part of the linoleum that would allow it to have that kind of springy reaction. So this happened. So he began this invention in 1855. In 1864, he established the Linoleum Manufacturing Company at Staines near London, and other inventors began their own experiments even after Walton took out his patent. And in 1871, William Parnicott took out a patent for a method of producing linoxin by blowing hot air into a tank of linseed oil for several hours and then cooling the material in trays. So it was a patented process rather than a trademarked name. But everyone kind of discovered the usefulness of linoleum and began a race toward who could manufacture the most for, what was at the end of the Industrial Revolution. People were building houses and, even apartments and other buildings, certainly commercial buildings, all required some kind of durable flooring.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that basically linoleum was designed in two ways. Well, there are sort of three interesting things here. First of all, linoleum was designed in two ways. So you had an inlaid version, which was made by laying different solid colors of linoleum pieces into a pattern. And so this now is a big deal in Victorian homes. Or you could have a printed version with a pattern that was printed only on the linoleum surface. And today, many companies make a product that's often called linoleum, but it's not made in the same way. It's a polyvinyl chloride, it's a PVC, and the flooring industry today calls this sheet vinyl or linoleum, but it's not what Holmes and Watson walked on. And that's important because one of the shortcomings, the interest of this early linoleum is resonant in that comment from the Naval Treaty, which is that it was susceptible to stains, and it was obviously because they're looking for a footprint or something in it. It's also susceptible to oxidation. So it wasn't so it's been replaced really today by other substances that are, more durable, more customizable. And indeed, vinyl flooring today can look very convincingly like wood.
That is true. Yeah, and even in Walton's time, I guess he had he explored the other use of his process, and he even started another product called Linoleum Muralis in 1877, which later became better known as Lincrusta.
Lincrusta.
It's such an attractive name. It's a highly durable linoleum wall covering, and it could be manufactured to resemble carved plaster or wood or even leather. And that became very successful as well, and inspired a cheaper imitation called Anaglypta. I knew Anaglypta. You know, she was a bit of a wallflower herself.
Yeah, well, no wonder she was a wallflower.
Yeah.
You know, she looked a lot like plaster or leather.
So, I mean, it really produced a whole bunch of cottage industries around it. But getting back to the Canon, in the Naval Treaty, you know, there was mentioned that creamy linoleum, which I love. And Holmes deduced that the thief came in a cab. He says, if Mr. Phelps is correct in stating that there is no hiding place either in the room or the corridors, then the person must have come from the outside. If he came from the outside on so wet a night and yet left no trace of damp upon the linoleum, which was examined within a few minutes of his passing, then it's exceedingly probable that he came in a cab. So if someone had come in dripping wet from being out in the rain, from walking around in the rain, they would have been dripping all over the floor and would have left a trail along the linoleum.
Well, and linoleum really became enormously popular, was a feature of floors pretty much everywhere, including Dr. Watson's home. Because when we get to the man with the twisted lip, very early in the case, you know, we find out exactly what the flooring of Dr. Watson's passageway looks like, because it's in June of 1889. There's a ring at the bell. Watson says it's about the hour when a man gives his first yawn and glances at the clock, and his wife lays down her needlework and makes a little face of disappointment. Oh, a patient, you'll have to go out. And they hear the door open, a few hurried words, and then, says Watson, quick steps upon the linoleum. Our own door flew open, and a lady clad in some dark-colored stuff. Stuff, with a black veil, entered the room. Oh, and it turns out, of course, to be Kate Whitney in the cases. Off we go to the case, but there's linoleum at the residence of Dr. Watson, Dr. and Mary Watson.
I love that. It's just such a wonderful image of domestic life in the evening. And, of course, they must have a servant who answered the door as they were sitting there, and Watson heard the footsteps on the linoleum. Similarly, in one other story, we find our last mention of linoleum. It's also at Watson's house. It's in the opening of The Crooked Man. One summer night, a few months after my marriage, I was seated by my own hearth, smoking a last pipe and nodding over a novel. For my day's work had been an exhausting one. It seems like these linoleum mentions come late in the evening at the Watson household. He heard the clang of the bell, looked at the clock. It was 11:45. Couldn't be a visitor. Patient, maybe, but he went into the hall and opened the door himself. To my astonishment, it was Sherlock Holmes. And he says, I'll fill a vacant peg. Sorry to see that you've had the British workman in the house, Watson. He's a token of evil. Not the drains, I hope. No, the gas. He's left 2 nail marks from his boot upon your linoleum where the light strikes it. So look at that, the British workman with nails in his boots.
And a song in his heart. Well, this is enormously convenient for Sherlock Holmes, because if these people had hard wooden floors, if they had carpeting, unless their visitors were dropping, little bits of mud or moisture from rainy streets, he would have nothing to observe. But here, and this talks to the earlier comment about the flaws of linoleum. It's sort of susceptible to stains and and to
Punctures,
these kinds of
yeah. But
impressions if you're walking around with
this raises
hobnailed
another
boots.
question to me, and maybe this is a trifle. Just how would a boot nail exhibit itself that it would leave a mark on the floor? How could you tell that it was from the boot of a tradesman? In other words, is there a specific kind of boot that they wear that has nails protruding to help them, say, climb poles or something or other? Or
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I would presume, I don't know or remember really any details about so-called hobnailed boots or why, in fact, they're called hobnailed boots. But I can imagine that that broadly speaking, if you were Lord St. Simon and you need to have your boots resoled, you would be going to your bootmaker, who would be doing a better job than the resource called upon by a tradesman who might be dealing with someone who would just be nailing heels or a sole rather less carefully into the boot, and thereby leaving the heads protruding, and thereby allowing the marks of those nails to be making an impression in linoleum. And from Holmes's perspective, they would be a certain distance apart, would be an impression, maybe an inch or 3/4 of an inch away from another exactly identical impression.
Sure, yeah.
But don't go by me because I just made all that up.
Well, that makes a great deal of sense, the way you've stated it. And as I look at images of hobnailed boots on the internet here as we're chatting, I could see how a tradesman might wear these kinds of boots for more traction, although you wouldn't be strolling around the cobblestone streets or the pavement with them. They might be helpful if you're getting into a garden or some other kind of area.
Well, the other thing is durability, So looking online now, I see hobnail is a short nail with a thick head used to increase the durability of boot soles or provide traction. So I guess for a tradesman, you'd be interested in the marvelously uncomfortable but much more durable
Yes.
footwear.
That is great. Well, speaking of durability, we have our durable fans who support us on Patreon and Substack, and we are going to bring out the big prize wheel to determine exactly which one of you is going to be the recipient of a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. So let's give it a spin. And it slows down, coming to rest on number 51. 51, and that looks like Maxine Renneker. Maxine, congratulations, and thank you for supporting us. We'll have that prize in the mail to you. If you'd like to have an opportunity to win like Maxine did, simply go to trifles.substack.com or patreon.com/trifles. Well, Bert, that wraps us up for the month of May.
Hooray!
I can't believe we've done it already. Back in another week. My goodness, what are we going to be talking about in June? Any idea?
Oh, yes, I do. But unfortunately, if I tell you, you'd have to, first of all, you haven't signed an NDA.
Yes, that is true. Well, you can count on two things for sure. In June, we'll have something from our travel series and something of old scholarship under the guise of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the theorist. If you have suggestions that you'd like to send in to us, by all means, just email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. Oh, and one more thing. I almost forgot about this. I realized that for people who don't necessarily want to call in, as we've given our number out before, you can also text us. Did you know that?
Oh, I did know that, yeah.
Yeah. If you would like to leave us a message via text, it is as simple as texting 5 1895-221B5. That's 518-952-2125. That is the number. You can text us whatever you feel like.
So simple. Well, in fact, I'm going to text us, later today. And the one thing we didn't mention is that in our discussion of Linoleum is what happened to poor old Frederick Walton, who had these influence of competitors and didn't trademark his name and had all these various experiments. He had no one to text him to tell him to be careful. And what happened was his factory burned down, his first factory burned down, and he himself, he's beavering around, with all of these smelly substances, suffered from persistent and painful rashes. Oh. And friends, if you listen to Trifles and become a Patreon supporter, you will be free of persistent and painful rashes, and that is not a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Mrs. Hudson, you're dreadfully underfoot.